Hey, good morning, First Christian Church. Today marks the beginning of week 17 of our foundation study. Also today, we begin reading the book of 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel ended with Saul being killed in battle. And now, at the beginning of this book, David hears of Saul's death. A quick review of Saul's life will remind us that he was God's chosen and anointed king over Israel, but also that he was a weak and half-hearted leader. Because of this, God had decreed that his son Jonathan would not inherit the throne upon his death, and in his place had proclaimed that David was the heir apparent. This caused no small amount of bitterness and jealousy to well up in Saul's heart, and he devoted much time and energy to trying to destroy David. His efforts ultimately proved to be in vain, and as we see in chapter 2, David is indeed anointed as king over Israel. This morning I'd like you to notice, though, David's reaction when he is informed of Saul's death. Verses 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 1 tell us that upon receiving the news, David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Again, remember that Saul had desperately and repeatedly tried to destroy David, and that Saul's death meant that David could assume the crown. Even so, David is truly distraught, and he mourns the death of Saul and Jonathan. He weeps because he knows what this means for the country, and he punishes the Amalekite who dared to put Saul to death. David has this reaction because he knows that Saul was chosen by God to rule over the country. And because of that fact and that fact alone, he respects and honors him. And honoring Saul, David also honors God. And I believe that quite possibly that is the key takeaway for us. See, over the past few months, we have experienced things that many of us never even considered to be possible. The chaos and confusion and loss has only deepened the political divide in this country. People tend to either love or to hate our political leaders. They consume media that reinforces their belief, and they freely express their opinions in social media monologues that range from the absurd to the obscene. This is where the example that David sets for us is refreshing. Now listen to me. He's not perfect, but in this case he is right. He was right then, and he would be right today regarding his response to the governing authority. Let me read for us the opening verses of Romans chapter 13. That passage says this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." 2 verses later, the Apostle Paul goes on to refer to leaders as God's servants. The point is that God is still sovereign. He is still working in our lives and still ordaining and using governments for His glory and for our good. This is not to say that all leaders are good or even competent, but all are due respect. Christians, therefore, should be like David and model this attitude. We ought to pray for our governing authorities and sincerely desire that they would lead us wisely. And while I think it's fine to engage in conversations regarding them, we ought to do so with truth and love and respect. Our words and attitudes should be markedly different than those of the world at large. This may not be easy, but by the grace and power of God, it is possible. In closing, let me also remind you that as Christians, this state, this country, this world is not our real home. Our citizenship is ultimately in heaven, and heaven is ruled by the good and gracious and perfect King. It is in Him that we have hope, and it is through Him that we find life regardless of our present circumstances. May God continue to bless and to watch over you all. Have a great day.